Hello and welcome to SIGGRAPH 2022 in Vancouver. This is a course on virtual nature as a digital twin, botanically correct 3D, AR, and VR optimized low polygon and photogrammetry high polygon plant models. This is a course that has 3 parts. The first part is about the context in which this research was conceived and executed for educational applications. So creating virtual models of nature as digital twins is extremely important from data. It's not the metaverse, which could be fake or fantasy based for entertainment, but a digital twin of the natural world to empower students in understanding nature and the concepts around biology, botany, ecology, geology from an authentic, high information fidelity perspective that is then visualized in game engines for high graphical fidelity, interaction, and multimodal experience, similar to a field trip. So that is the context I hope to present in part 1. Part 2 of this course will be led by Chris Jones in creating the low polygon, highly accurate plant models for augmented reality and VR headsets that require respect of the device's processing power. The third part will be led by Crissy Peters in how to use photogrammetry with reality capture and Unreal Engine 5 to create the highest graphical fidelity representations of high information fidelities models of plants in virtual environments. I am Maria Harrington. I'm an associate professor at the University of Central Florida. My research investigates using AR, VR, and GIS data sets to create these digital twin models of nature for educational applications. My research really investigates the human-computer environment interactions. These are dynamic interactions that allow us to isolate different design factors in the artifact and measure their outcome on the human's experience of these environments. That's where I'm really interested. So Chris Jones was an undergraduate student in the Games and Interactive Media program at UCF. He's become one of the lead foliage and botanical artists, phenomenal talent, and I owe him a great deal in being able to execute these products. He's phenomenal. Crissy Peters was a master's student in the Florida Interactive Entertainment Academy at UCF, and she also is a phenomenal environmental artist, and she's pioneered different methods of using photogrammetry of foliage, which I think is very important. Part 1, virtual nature models. Here we go. So all good research begins with a research question. And years ago, when I was a PhD student at the University of Pittsburgh, I was fascinated with how motivational students were on field trips to a natural park. And I thought, can simulated environments, ecological environments, these geospatial environments, these digital twins of nature inspire independent exploration and an intrinsic desire to learn with acts of creation for the child? I saw awe and wonder, a need to know, a need to share and create these environments in the real world. So I was thinking, can we use game technology, specifically at this time, it was Unreal Tournament. You could create mods to recreate reality true to the data, right? To ground truth these models. They were not meant for entertainment, edutainment, or any kind of fantasy expression. So importing the terrain files from ESRI, working with botanists to understand the correct plant inventory, the list of plants in that environment, their densities, the population densities was really important. And then infusing it with factual educational facts and educational stories to make that information self-expose at the moment of inquiry was an important design framing. What I was creating and what I'm still creating are these immersive knowledge artifacts. And artifacts is really art as fact, right? So it has a higher standard. And then investigating the immersive and formal learning impacts, the environment as a factor in learning, and how the human interacts with the environment, especially the natural world, not the man-made world. And then of course, I'm enchanted with this question of beauty. And beauty is the most salient aggregate signal in the environment that creates that sense of awe and wonder and a desire to know. All right, so fast forward, I'm now at the University of Central Florida. We have an arboretum, and the arboretum has data stored in an ESRI data set, which I wanted to visualize with accurate three-dimensional botanical models in Unreal Engine. So we took a 100 hectare or 247 acre plot of the UCF Arboretum, and we were able to successfully model it and simulate it and visualize it. So that is basically the main research program here. Virtual nature is making knowledge beautiful. That's my opinion. And for those of you who are too impatient to listen to all of these or jump forward to Chris or Chrissy's presentation, you can go to the Harrington lab at the itch.io site, download the Arboretum, and actually give it a try. There's also a second project that was really inspired by the UCF project at the Carnegie Museum. And this was an augmented reality application that can run on phones or tablets. And that too is available through the Carnegie Museum of Natural History's iTunes store. All right, so these applications can be deployed on a wide range of different display devices. This is a student interacting on a virtual field trip on a desktop. Other students and faculty were exploring it in headsets. That's an HTC Vive. And then a research project that was recently funded was to connect it to a treadmill for the ability for people to walk through and choose any direction, go off trail, and explore this large environment to scale as a human would naturally explore the natural world by walking through it. We're running that study right now. All right, so what we have is a wide array of ability to take this model, this digital twin of the virtual natural environment, and display it on many different output devices, and then measure those interaction styles and design factors and impacts on the human learning or exploring or remembering the systems. We also have, because it's geometric, right? We can make each object interactive and connect it to facts and stories and information through the metadata. And we've done that as well. How did we do this? So the main topic here is the process and the construction methods that we used that could be generalized to any environment. At the UCF Arboretum, we started off with a map of the Arboretum. And this is a typical GIS map where each color is indexed to a natural community type. Each natural community type has a set of plants that have been recorded as present in that location, as well as the population data. So for example, the circled area here, this circle number 7, which is teal, and it has green diagonal stripes on the key, that is actually the dome swamp. And so we would look into the database and find the plants that were recorded through field study, plot studies in the dome swamp, and find out what plants were there, link that to the 3D models and visualize them on the map. But we also had to understand the plant population densities. So in this example, in the dome swamp, there is a pond cypress tree. And in the database, they recorded that 20% of the dome swamp was covered by the cypress tree. So in the Unreal Engine, we set the foliage tool to 20%, and it automatically covers that particular area 20% with that tree. And we did that for all the 35 plants that we modeled. Whenever we had a clear line of sight, we augmented the information to reach a higher level of information fidelity through these drone photographs. And the photographs could identify through a direct line of sight exact individuals and where they were. So instead of a statistical extrapolation of the area with a species, we could find the exact location. And in this example, the pond had a clean line of sight from the drone, and we could see all of the pond water lilies. So in the Unreal level, we placed the pond water lilies in those exact locations. So we're always trying to increase the level of fidelity, information fidelity in the model, right? Whoops, let's go back to that. Here's an example of the 10 different natural communities and about 35 different plants. And what we see here is that for each location, each natural community, we have different percent population densities of each of the plants in our inventory. So here's an example: the pond cypress tree in the Dome Swamp had 20% coverage. In other natural communities, it had different percentages. So whenever the map location indicated that you were in a different natural community, we shifted those population densities. And you can see how one plant or a list of 35 plants gives you a really nice way to quickly and efficiently model an entire area with the data that you have, right? So here's an example. We took the pond cypress tree, it was one model, and we set it to scale the real trees data. So the height and the spread of each plant is recorded in a virtual field guide. And then we can create that variance so that graphically it is reading true to the human. They're not identical. They are the same model, but by rotating them and changing their heights a little and their spread a little, it creates that variance that allows the perceptual system to read it as more realistic, right? And here's an example of the drone images. The photograph gave us the locations for the pond water lilies, and we were able to actually put them there. So that's the idea, that anyone can use in any environment these two methods, right? Bottom up and top down at the same time. The plants themselves were being modeled by students, undergraduate students in the games and interactive media program. We were going out into the field and collecting photographs in the field with the botanists, with the biologists. There was a very careful review of modeling them to match the height and the spread, isolating different components of the plants, the stem, the leaf, the flowers, parts of the flowers, the stamens, the pistils. So we had all of these pieces photographed, and then the students would reconstruct them. And this is really the traditional method of building any model. It's with photographs and textures, and then 3D models in Maya or Blender, whatever 3D modeling tool that you're using. So you create the 3D model, and then you cover it, you almost like wallpaper a sculpture with the textures. And this actually was a very important part. It was collaborative, it was iterative between the botanists and the students to refine this model and to make it accurate, and then approved it. So that's a process that can be generalized to any environment too. But I can't stress the importance of working in a team more, that this is really important. All right, so photos in the field, students were very careful to gather these images of plants. Certainly endangered plants were not disturbed. And I do have to stress this too, that students who might be using this course should probably just go to Home Depot or any nursery and buy a plant and not go out into the field. Don't work alone, and think about respecting the natural environment as much as possible, because plants are endangered as well, right? Okay. So here's an example of students out in the field taking photographs and working in teams and isolating different components and taking many different photos to create their models. It's also very helpful to have a grid where you have measurements, and that can be used later in Maya as a reference. You could actually put that reference in Maya and then build your model for 5 different shots, right? You want a north-facing, an east-facing, south-facing, west-facing shot to create a box in Maya, and also top-down, so that you have the top view and you have the entire structure referenced and researched well. This resulted in a set of 35 models. We used Sketchfab to host the draft models, and we worked in virtual teams. This was pre-COVID, but it worked extremely well, where the students and the botanists would co-review each plant and identify errors that the students may have made and ideas for how to correct them. One story is that we built this beautiful model of the longleaf pine, and the botanist said, well, where are the candles? And we said, what candles? And they said, the new growth at the top of the canopy. Well, we were on the ground. We couldn't see the canopy. Only the botanist had that knowledge that was able to enhance the reality of the virtual model of the plant. There are many other examples of this that perception is an interesting phenomena, right? Like perception is really a top-down, bottom-up process where we only see what we know. So we need the knowledge in order to actually perceive it in reality. If we don't have the knowledge, it's invisible to us, right? And I saw the transition of students who went out knowing absolutely nothing about the plants, and only after these artistic, scientific development projects developed a sensitivity to what they were seeing in the real world. You know, another story is a native student in Florida, lived in Central Florida her entire life. She was working on a saw palmetto, which was one of the most common plants. It's everywhere, right? And she struggled with it. You know, the first few models were very geometric, they were vertical or horizontal, and she didn't have the negative space or the flow or the different variation in growth patterns and shapes and colors and textures. 6 months later, she walks into my office, you know, wide-eyed, Dr. Harrington, they're everywhere. And she showed me her model at that moment, and it was wonderful. So she actually didn't see that plant in the environment until she was able to internalize it and fully understand it. That was a process. So I think this is an interesting area for education research, right? That drawing is really sharpening your eyes. It is learning more about the knowledge that's in the world to be able to see it. And so drawing is a way of enhancing your perceptual abilities. That's important for everyone. Scientists, engineers, artists, everyone should have a knowledge-infused perceptual interpretation of the world, right? That it means something, there's meaning there. So that's interesting. I cannot thank my domain experts enough. Dr. John Wenzel, who was at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History and director of the Powder Mill Nature Reserve, he provided a great deal of help, and so did Bonnie Isaac, who was the botanist at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, and Dr. Patrick Bohlen, of course, who is the director of the UCF Arboretum and a professor in the Department of Biology. They all were fabulous in helping support the accuracy of these models. So one lesson to take away in the context here, that is the first part of this talk, is a process that can be generalized, I think, to any educational domain. Anytime you are building a digital twin for educational applications, you should certainly start with the domain expert and allow them to help you find the correct sourced content, right? There are only 35 plants we modeled in the Arboretum, so which plants were most important? That's really up to the domain expert to choose, right? There are thousands of plants. So which ones really make a difference? Which ones matter the most? And then all of the facts about them, their height, their spread, all of the field guide data, the metadata that's important for, do they need sun? Do they need shade? Do they need water? Do they need dry soil? And all those factors go into the place, the geospatial location, the reason why it thrives in that location. That's domain knowledge. And once we got all of this information, much like working with collaborators on a paper, before publication, you cycle, you iterate, you improve the quality. Sometimes there are typos, sometimes something was missing. So that would cycle until we had the information that the domain experts approved and released. It was their role and their responsibility to kick it over to the digital media team, right, to release it. And then the art students in the games program were able to create the 3D models. And they did so at the best of their naive perceptual ability, right? That they were starting out from a naive perspective. They didn't really know the plant at the beginning. But once they finished the model to the best of their ability, we entered into a co-scientific review process with the botanists. And that cycled between the domain expert and the modeler, domain expert and modeler. They were working together to cycle to create the highest aesthetic and scientifically accurate models. And then it was approved and released by the domain expert, since that was their role and responsibility to approve that the model was indeed the correct visualization of the plant in the real world. Once that happened, we entered into your traditional user-centered design process for the application development. And that was to enhance the user experience by driving down errors and time on task to achieve goal. So we cycled iteratively with user experience feedback to enhance the application from a usability standpoint. Once it worked, that's when I took it into the field with an IRB approved study to evaluate the educational effect, right? The efficacy and the effect of it. So we were then using this as an artifact to research informal learning in museums or with the public. And once we end this first cycle, you can loop again, right? You can take all of this information and improve the design for the next cycle. And that's basically a expert learner user experience design process that is an extension of the user experience design process. And I call that ELEX. I think that's kind of cute, but anyone can use that process. So here's a short sample. I have a video here of how people were approving it. I'm going to skip that. You can go to it if you want. It's rather long. Oh, here's John. Okay. So again, going back to this concept of a good process yields a good product. And I am differentiating information fidelity from graphical fidelity. That we can have highly photorealistic graphical fidelity environments created for fantasy. Think of Avatar, the movie, really photorealistic, total fantasy. And they're different, they're orthogonal. Information fidelity deals with the accuracy. It can be enhanced with graphical fidelity. And we need the graphical fidelity for immersion. I mean, that's been talked about quite a lot. But what I'm doing is not entertainment. This is supposed to be used for education and learning. And when is knowledge acquisition important? When is the accuracy in knowledge important? It is when there are high costs for poor decisions. So if the education does not result in high accuracy and knowledge transfer, then that person, that student, could make poor decisions in the future based upon inaccurate knowledge, right? So if we are concerned with this dimension of accuracy and knowledge, how do we design these immersive applications to produce the highest probability of high knowledge transfer, accurate knowledge transfer? Well, digital twins are about that, right? They're about having that high information fidelity so that we can build simulations, models, run different scenarios, inform our decisions, reduce our risk. And these are all applications that are important for military simulations or GIS intelligence or weather simulations, right? Environmental remediation, landscape architecture, real estate development, tourism, city planning, STEM education, and any kind of online work certification that is geospatial, right? You have the high information fidelity, the high graphical fidelity, you have the immersion, you have the presence, you have all of these factors are the result of the combined design factors of these systems. So I wanted to make this point here that these digital twins are very different than the metaverse because of the high information fidelity that we are able to express and transmit to the learner. And hopefully that will create better decisions, right? Decision support and simulation. So these are very similar to how naturalists were trying to recreate information, document information in botanical prints or their field notes. If anyone's interested in accessing a wonderful database, it's available at the Smithsonian Institution. These are meant to communicate information, right? Although we see them as very beautiful as well, but they weren't created as an artistic or emotional experience. They were primarily created to capture information at a high detail and complexity about the plants in these botanical prints and communicate it. We also have herbariums, which many places are scanning plants or documenting them. There are the Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture has a phenomenal database with the Consortium of Pacific Northwest at the University of Washington. It's a great resource for getting data to visualize in these digital twins of nature. There are examples in museums. The Harvard Museum of Natural History has a phenomenal, the Ware collection of glass flowers, which is in a way, one of the original like old school virtual realities or augmented reality displays of plants. Really phenomenal. They've also played around with scale, which we can do. We can zoom in, zoom out, and get more detail based upon our frame of view of the information, visual information. Dioramas, everyone's familiar with, well, maybe not. I gave a talk at, I think it was IEEE, and some people didn't know what a diorama was. So a diorama is a three-dimensional reconstruction for education, and it embodies knowledge. It's an artifact that is used in museums to convey information about the world. This is an example of the Allegheny National Forest. So you have recreated trees in 3 dimensions. You have a little chipmunk running there and some flowers and moss and ferns and different plants that grow in this area. And they're typically annotated with signs as well. So how do traditional dioramas work as knowledge artifacts? These are typically annotated with facts and stories. Sometimes there are curators available or teachers or parents to help explain the information. Sometimes the scientist is there for an interactive discussion and learning opportunity. But these dioramas as physical, real world objects do not talk, right? They do not respond to questions. And if you do watch people in museums, you often see children go, ooh, and they run over and they point and they ask their parent, what is that? Well, the diorama can't respond, but someone has to facilitate the answers. And exhibits and dioramas were intentionally designed to evoke interest and curiosity and questions. What is that? Why is that? How is that? All these wonderful questions. So informal learning could be studied in museums, and I used this as the foundation for building a virtual experience similar to these. All right, so virtual dioramas. That led me to the AR Perpetual Garden. So using the same techniques to visualize these digital twins of nature, but displaying them on an iPad. And this was incredible because the entire gallery hall was transformed. It was an experience of the woodland springtime bloom with all the native species that only last for maybe a week or two. So no one had ever seen these flowers before, and yet it was in this environment. So it was transformational for those people to see this environment cascade out of the diorama and to be able to walk around the gallery floor and look down at the flowers and actually explore this space as a transformed space, an immersive space, really. These were also environments that were not only interactive for access to facts and stories, but they were multimodal. We paid very close attention to the types of insects and birds that would create the ambient bioacoustics. And in this particular situation, we had two different scenarios, two different data visualizations. One that represented the woodland imbalance when there weren't too many deer, and the second one, a woodland out of balance when the deer came and ate all of the plants. And that created what was called a trophic cascade. So when the plants are eaten by the deer, then the insects go away or they die. And then the birds have nothing to eat, they go away or they die. So the entire environment was transformed just by a click of a button. And you could toggle between these two alternative realities in context in the real world outside and also inside at the museum. That was the technical foundation for one study, two studies I did. It does transform the context of reality. You start to see and experience this spatial information in a totally new way. Like it's surprising, and it is beautiful, and it did evoke questions of why is that, or how is that, and that led them down a path of learning, investigating why this is happening, and so that was the end of this one. It was beautiful. We did this study in 2019, and the findings, I did a between subject design, one with no AR condition, in a traditional format of giving the volunteer subjects a catalog with identical facts and concepts that were in the app. And the app had a baseline of identical educational material. So that reduced, that held constant that variable, reducing the confounding variables, right? You only want to modify one variable in a research design. So it was AR or no AR, but everything else was equal. And the experimental condition, people were literally dragging their parents or grandparents around the gallery floor and saying ooh and ah and skipping around. It was adorable. The results here were surprising. There was actually no actual learning difference between the catalogs, facts and story, and the AR app. They were the same, although the AR app, you can see the variance is a little bit tighter than the no AR. However, on the post-experience survey, everyone said that the AR was a superior learning experience. So this data emphasizes the point that actual learning on a pre-test, post-test is different than a survey. All right, so be careful about that if you're evaluating your products, that a survey is perceptual, it's opinion-based, it's not actual. All right, so why did they think they learned more? There were more emotional reactions. They were more engaged. There was more immersion and more presence, and there was just a lot more emotional engagement in the augmented reality app than the booklet. That's what I think. But I'm interested as a designer in what are the factors here. And what I did was I ran a Spearman rank correlation and found that two factors were very significant to the actual learning on the tests, the difference between the pre-test and the post-test of facts and story. And that was actually the story and the plant info facts, right? These are correlated to the actual learning. That makes a lot of sense. If you're designing these digital twins, or you're designing these immersive environments for education, they have to be interactive with the educational content, right? The facts and the stories have to be accessible for them to learn. It's obvious. But the other thing that's really interesting is how all of the design factors of the visualization, the scenarios between the woodland in balance and out of balance, the two visualization scenarios, the bioacoustics, the flowers themselves were all correlated to story. So they're amplifying the learning aspect of the information that does not have graphical representation, right? Another important takeaway here is that the perceived learning on the surveys, they were correlated to the flowers and ease of use. So we have two different, like the opinions of why they learned related to factors that had no actual impact on actual learning. And that's important for designers to understand, to be able to tease out exactly what are the factors that are causing the outcomes that you hope to be designing these applications for, right? The interviews, the perceived learning interviews, they were short answers, and everyone was talking about the contrasting visualizations of the two scenarios. That's when they had the gestalt, the insight. Aha, this is what's going on. I get it. And so I think that if you are teaching a complex topic, there is power in applying a design scenario of different use cases or cause and effect that show what's going on under the model, right? So what we have here, I think, is an AR holodeck, right? We don't need a big room or a big cave. I think that we can achieve high levels of immersion and presence with handheld devices. And one thing that is important about that is pretty much, there's a wider actually installed base of handheld phones and tablets that are AR ready. So this is an immediate distribution channel that could transform schools. They could be used in backyards or homes. It's a really easy, accessible, efficient way to distribute educational digital twins and immersive environments for learning. It's real-time learning. It's knowledge in a pocket. You have knowledge in a pocket. So some of the takeaways here is that these virtual nature models, they can be generalized as GIS visualizations. We have the map that represents all the different communities, the data for the plants, the inventories, and the distribution for each plant population. That's an easy bottom-up way. Certainly there are drone images that can be used from top down. And the point is that with only 35 plants, we were able to very quickly, by changing the different percentages and the different combinations to represent these 10 different natural communities, very quickly create these very different environments. And so what we have are right now 70 different plants, AR and VR plant models for the Eastern United States. So that's from Maine to Puerto Rico that could be visualized as a good sample of these environments that are data visualizations. And they are free right now for Unreal 4 for Southeastern US and Northeastern US. So for educational purposes, you can download them and use them and try to recreate this process for your area. There are other resources available. I think the most important is the USDA plant hardiness zone map for the correct locations. And the reason is that you can take these plants and you can set them up in the foliage tools to visualize. Right? These are the southeastern plants. These are the northeastern plants. We have 35 in each. And in Unreal, depending upon your location, you can set those plant species, population densities to match the real world, and then use the brush to just very quickly, here's an example of the brush, right?
So what we've got here is we have a small test scene for demonstrations of 100 by 100 meters, as you can see down here. And if we go into our perspective view, this is that same 100 meter by 100 meter test space. And we have a foliage brush set to a size of 5,000 unreal units, which is a radius of 50 meters, so a diameter of 100 meters. And if we take our pond cypress here, we have our density set to 20%. So a single click with the brush or a single stroke over 100 meter by 100 meter area would give us about 20% coverage of the tree. So in this case, 24. If we tested it again, 23. We take that same idea and we apply it to a large test scene of 500 by 500 meters. And we can select our entire plant inventory, which has data accurate percentages set as far as density goes. And we can just paint on an entire environment with a single click and stroke. And then we can go down into that environment. And all of our different plant densities working together create this kind of believable and real environment. And if we were to take this data and change it to something inaccurate, for example, if we clear this scene off and we take our pond cypress trees, which should have a density of 20%, and we make it something crazy like 90%, we paint that on, it doesn't even look close to right. Our believable scene has become something that looks artificial. Definitely not something that you would walk around in and think it looks real. And the same can be said if we take that data and we go the other direction and set our cypresses to something like 0.5%. So even with all of the other plants accurate, single change to the data, and it just looks like a completely different environment. So if we go back, clear out this inaccurate stuff, and we set our density back to the data value of 20%, we can quickly paint on this environment, and it instantly looks like something that you'd really see walking around in the swamps of Florida. This would allow an artist to take plant models and very quickly create a realistic and believable environment without having to actually do the research. And they don't need to learn the way these plants grow or the actual densities if they have the data and the brush preset like this. Simple click and it's a believable environment.
Beautiful, Chris. Beautiful. Can you find that? What was it? The St. John's wort. It's really cute. Or oh, here we have
We'll
succeed, I guess.
see here's the wort.
Yeah.
All the way down to the stamens.
That's gorgeous. And then up above too. And beautiful cypress down. Wonderful job. Really beautiful. Really beautiful. You can also go in as an artist now and embellish, right? If you wanted to add individual species or
Right. It's very, very easy to go in, and if you wanted to add a holly to a certain spot, if you thought this little patch needed another tree.
like the holly, the bear scare. Yeah. All right. So it's wonderful. How much time do you think this saves you as an artist?
It's almost immeasurable to have a base environment at your fingertips that you can instantly lay out, and then embellish upon that instead of having to start from scratch and place individual plants and guess on numbers, and it could save you just hours.
And the variation is created by the data that we have for the height and the spread from the biologist. So each tree is slightly modified based upon the variance of the plant. It gives you that wonderful diversity without the hit on the performance. So it's very clever, really clever.
So here's the USDA plant hardiness zone. You can see that there are different locations across the United States. A band of color is correlated to a zone, and that is metadata for the plants that we have in our virtual field guide. You can find the zone data in the databases online, and you can then decide which plants you need in your location, and then find plant distribution data from plot studies to set the percentage in the foliage tool. This example of the pond cypress, its zone is 7B to 11B. So if you look at the USDA plant hardiness zone map, you can see that's quite a large area. That's from North Carolina to Puerto Rico, Florida, Texas. That whole area, that plant could actually survive and thrive in that area. So my thought here is that working from the data, the visualization of these environments, that beauty is truth and truth is beauty. We work together in digital twins. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me at maria.harrington@ucf.edu. And I would love to talk to you more. Right now, I'm going to hand the presentation off to Chris Jones for the second set of this course. Thank you.
Hi, welcome to Virtual Nature as a Digital Twin, botanically correct 3D, AR, and VR optimized low-poly plant models. My name is Chris Jones. I'm a UCF alumni, and I got my bachelor's in digital media game design. I specialize as a 3D environment artist, and I've spent a lot of time working on the virtual UCF Arboretum project, as well as the Carnegie Museum's AR Perpetual Garden app. Almost all of that time was spent building out plant models, working with botanists, and kind of creating this process that I'm about to share with you now. So the purpose of this process is to create a model that can be used in applications that require performance-friendly assets, so really low-poly plants, LODs, just highly optimized stuff that doesn't sacrifice scientific accuracy or believability. We use real-world photographs to create our models and textures, but we don't actually do photogrammetry. Again, this is perfect for things that require really optimized assets like AR phone apps, VR, games, and in this example course, we're going to be looking at the blue-violet. The process begins with, of course, gathering source material for the model, but also really getting an understanding of the plant that we're making. Looking at photographs helps, but seeing the plant in the field, if possible, really can provide just an invaluable level of understanding of the plant's form, kind of the way it grows, how it spreads, just the way that it exists in nature rather than being just the sum of a bunch of textures. Again, just looking at photographs can kind of fail to reveal this, so we always go out into the field and observe our plants and take that into the model. So when we're examining a plant and gathering our source material, it's really vital to gain an understanding of the way the plant grows, from individual leaves to the way that multiple versions of the same plant will kind of spread out when growing near each other. We like to ask ourselves questions when we're observing the plants to kind of take that back with us for when we're creating the model, like, do they spread out? Do they clump together? Do leaves of a single plant overlap? Does the plant kind of bend under its own weight, or is it affected in certain ways by wind? Do you see a lot of color variation within the plant, like leaf decay, all kinds of factors like that, just things to consider when building out the model. So another step we take before we're actually building the model is to kind of combine our field work and source gathering with just research. We combine knowledge that we gather in the field with scientific study and data. When we can, we have a back and forth with botanists, which really helps, but that's not always available. So just doing online research can be really valuable. You can reference scientific field guides to get really valuable data on multiple aspects of the plant. And that can help to fill gaps in field information, stuff you might miss or just not even be able to see. Things like that can include just the general height or spread of a plant, the size of leaves, how many there are, how they distribute, really specific things like the number of petals or stamen on a flower is something that's really easy to miss or hard to perceive when the flowers are really small. And then just things like general habitat information, like where they grow, the population densities, all kinds of things like that can really assist when making a model. Another useful reference to have when creating these botanically accurate models is botanical drawings. Natural factors that you would see out in the fields can really change how a plant appears or grows, especially non-natural factors too, like landscaping and things like that. So having a botanical reference, a botanical drawing reference, can really help you build out a more accurate model where even some source material that you gather yourself might kind of falter a little bit. But you should always reference the botanical drawing with real world photos as well, and create a whole picture from those things combined. So in order to gather usable and useful source material, it's really important to have the right equipment with you in the field. The most important being a really high quality camera, something that can take a lot of photos, both for reference photos and also photos to kind of pull and create textures from. So really high quality. Having video capabilities is also a plus. You definitely need a measuring tool, something to take actual recorded measurements in the field, and also for reference in photos to kind of line them up with the plants as you take photos to help you kind of scale the plants better. You absolutely need some kind of backdrop. Ideally, it would be white to help prevent some weird color stuff going on when you're creating textures. And the size really depends on the plant you're capturing. For something small like our blue violet, it's just a plain piece of paper works really well. It's easy to maneuver. To take these photos, like here you can see the high contrast with the kind of large leaf on the blue violet is really, really useful. On a larger plant like a bush or even parts of a tree, definitely some kind of large white sheet or board or something like that. So when you're out in the field taking photographs of plants to create a model, it's really important to envision the way that you'll be building out the model to make sure you're getting useful photos. You should consider what parts of the model could be flat planes, maybe how you'll build out, in this case, the stem of a flower, the way that the petals curve, different parts that you'd need to recreate that plant as a 3D model. In general, it's important to always try to capture flat and evenly lit photos of the key parts of each plant. The best time to do this is in overcast weather outside, but if you can't get rid of the sunlight, the more even the lighting on the plant, the better. The key parts of a plant include leaves, flower petals, buds, stems, and even in some larger plants, just a whole branching structure could be considered a key part. It's really important to always capture multiple variations of each part. That way you have the option to create texture variation later on. Even in a plant as small as the blue violet here, it's probably only got 6 leaves. It's still useful to have 2 or 3 different types. That way each leaf doesn't look identical. Especially in a plant with more leaves, you definitely don't want the same leaf just appearing all over the place. This is also where it's useful to capture maybe a little video, if you can, of the plant kind of moving in the wind, maybe even the way it reacts to sunlight, like the way the light bleeds through leaves. All things like that can be really helpful when kind of finalizing the model later on. Once we've gathered our source material and kind of an understanding of the plant, we can begin planning out the actual model itself. We begin this process using a combination of, in our case, Maya and Photoshop. Before we start building out the model, it's really important to set up a nice workspace in Maya This includes making sure that you have your scene unit set to whatever it is you want. We use centimeters, and we like to lay out reference photos in the scene to be able to constantly refer to those while we're building out our model. They help with sizing, kind of scale, things like that. And we just do this by adding a plane primitive with the material and using source photos as the color for those. Another thing we do is we always include 1-1 primitives that match our scene units, and we set those to values that match our actual scientific data for the plant. So the size of this little rectangle here is the exact height of a usual blue-violet. We'll probably also create a one for width here, just general idea for spread. And these tools can really help increase the accuracy of the model, and especially when it comes to scale of leaves versus petals and stems. It really helps the believability as well. And it can a lot of times help to have more than one source photo, even if you're just basing your scale off of one, having another just to get an idea of color variation and kind of growth patterns just in the scene with you can be really useful. So we usually set up a couple, like we're doing here. And it's important to choose ones that, different angles, so this one shows a different type of, a different growth of flowers, not just a single one. Yeah. A key part of our process for creating a low poly plant model without using any sculpting, we don't use any photogrammetry, is to create the texture map in Photoshop in tandem with our model creation in Maya. We build out the meshes using the textures, and the texture map is kind of filled out based on what we need to create in Maya. Complex plants may have multiple materials, multiple texture sheets, but small plants, kind of like our blue violet here, will sometimes either share a texture sheet with another plant or just have their own small single texture sheet for the entire plant. Our blue violet has a single 1024 by 1024 texture sheet, and that's it. So in order to create a texture sheet for our plants, we need to determine which plant parts will be on that texture sheet. The important parts of a model will vary totally based on the source plant, but they should always be determined using your source photographs. In the example of our blue violet, this is probably our best source photograph that we have, and we can see a few really important standout plant parts there. There's quite a few different types of leaves. There's notably a really large flat one. There's one that's kind of curled up like a cylinder, which is really cool. There's also small ones coming out right behind and underneath the flower petals that we definitely wouldn't want to miss. There's, of course, the flower petals themselves. Some of them have kind of noticeable white coloring going up into them. Some have a little bit less, so it'd probably be good to have both of those. Of course, we'd need a material for our stem, and also the stamen at the center of the flower is a really important part. There's another part, a spur underneath the flower, which is kind of really hard to see, but our study and research from before would tell us that each flower on a blue violet does in fact have a spur. So you really don't want to miss things like that, and it's why kind of getting an understanding of the plant and learning about it before actually making the model is really important, because things like that are really easy to miss. So once we have our list of desired plant parts, we can begin laying out the kind of initial primitives for each part that our textures will then be applied to. We always want to base the size of these primitives on the frame reference photo, although we can of course scale them later on. It's just better to start as close as we can get. As you can see here, we've created a few larger plane primitives that would eventually become leaves, and with varying sizes, and then also flower petals and the small leaves there underneath the flower itself. And we're scaling those to be about as close as we can get, although we will edit them later on to match more closely. And then of course the spur under the flower as well. And then the stamen. Just double checking that we have everything from our list that we need beyond kind of the branching stem structure. Which it looks like we do. So the next thing we would do would be, in this case, to create our stem structure from the middle. And we do this in a really simple way. We just start with a cylinder primitive, kind of bring the polys down a bit, and we just build it out. For larger plants like trees with trunks, they'll often receive their own separate material, like a repeatable bark texture, and they wouldn't need to share a UV space with the other plant parts. In the example of our blue violet here, the stems are small enough that we can kind of just contain them within the same UV space as the rest of the parts, and then we just have one simple material for the whole plant. But here we're kind of just taking this cylinder primitive and manipulating it in a way that kind of matches our source photo there in the background, which is an example of why it's so important to have that Maya workspace set up where you can constantly be referencing photos. And during this process, you should, of course, be referencing your other photos and your data and your, all of your field work and research, just to make sure the plant retains both the accuracy and, of course, the believability. And yeah, that's the start of a little stem structure. And the final array of kind of separate plant parts would look something like this, a collection of things that we can then use to, we can combine them into our final mesh. So with all of our plant parts and meshes set up and ready to go, we can begin UVing. The UVs for the texture sheet should, of course, be laid out based on the mesh or plant part size, but eventually we want to use the entire, 1-1 space of the UV sheet. Larger plants like a tree would probably have a UV dedicated to branches and a UV dedicated to the trunk structure. But in this case, we are just using one single texture sheet, so all of our individual plant parts will be laid out like this in a single sheet. So all of our leaves, our petals, stamens, and then even the stem structure, just filling in all of the space we can in that UV. And then, of course, once it's complete, we'll create a UV snapshot to take in Photoshop. So in Photoshop, we'll create a new project with the canvas or image size based on how large we want our texture sheet to be. In the case of the blue violet, that's 1024 by 1024. We'll just go ahead and add our UV snapshot in there, and then we can begin extracting textures from our source photos. This really just involves deleting or removing excess imagery from around the plant part, either through color selection. If you have a really good background, you can just delete all the white or whatever color you use for your background. Or in this case, it's not a perfect, we don't have a perfect background, but the leaf is still a really good picture of the leaf, so we'll just cut it out by hand using an eraser. Generally, you want to go for a really high quality photo, something that'll translate really well to a texture, something believable. It's okay if it's not, the perfect leaf. Usually kind of this leaf has a little bit of damage, maybe a little bit of dirt on it, and that actually adds to the believability as well. And you just want to remove all of the excess, just everything except for exactly the part of the plant that you want. And again, the quality of the image here is key, as since we don't have a high quality sculpt or photogrammetry to build normals from, we will be building our normals from the textures themselves. So once our kind of cutout of our plant part is done and ready to go, we will just check for some artifacts, make sure it's all nice and clean. These can be artifacts left over from a color selection or even from erasing by hand in this case. And you don't want those appearing kind of in the opacity layer for the texture, so we'll clean those up. And then we can take that plant part, get those edges nice and clean, and then we can take that plant part and align it with our UVs here. Just in any way, whatever way we can to put the most texture into the UV space without crossing the edges. And the size matches up pretty well because based on what we did before, sizing the UV space based on the source photo that we even got this texture from. Yeah. So once we've completed that process for each individual piece of the plant model we're making, we'll have a complete texture sheet. Just to go over it, each plant part should match the UVs we created in Maya. And for materials like we have our UVs from our stem cylinders there, those we can just begin with a solid color and we'll add detail to that later on. Unless, of course, there was a good source photo of the stem that could be layered on top of that UV. Of course, make sure there's no overlap on the UV edges, especially for things like leaves that require transparency. And at the end, we hide the UV snapshot in the black background and we export it as a PNG. So with a first version of our texture sheet ready to go, we will return to Maya and add our exported texture map from Photoshop to our meshes, just as a single material with the exported texture as the color. This would be a good time to resize meshes to more closely match the source image, or to just measure them in Maya with the little measurement tools we created earlier. And with the textures on there, we're ready to start putting them all together. Before we actually start, putting our meshes together and creating the full model, we'll want to take another look at our primitives and add a little more detail. We'll do this by adding polygons to especially our large plane primitives like leaves that we have here. We can either use add divisions. Multicut is a great tool for this. It gives you a lot of control over where you're adding these edges to the plant. And it's important to just consider which parts would need to have more curvature and detail. Parts like leaves almost always have that kind of curvature. Flower petals often bend in different directions. There are very few parts, except for really small things, that should ever remain as a plane primitive. I think in this case the only part that does is the spur, the small spur underneath the flower of our blue violet. Because this is a really low poly optimized model, we of course want to keep the poly count down, so we're really only adding a few polys to these leaves just to get just enough shape there to be believable and accurate. As you can see here, we're just adding a little bit of curvature based on our source photos, based on what we saw out in the field, the way these leaves kind of sit. Yeah. A full kind of library of individual plant parts with polys added could look something like this. In the case of our blue violet, we have that cylindrical leaf. We've got a nice large bending leaf, and we've got quite a few different versions of the flower petal just because they bend in so many different ways that it's really important to capture that in the actual model. So now that we have all of our plant parts textured, we've added some polys to create believability in shape and form, we can start actually combining them together to create this model. We should, of course, continue to reference the source photos and our measurements, and as we put it together, we may notice that some of the different parts aren't sized exactly correctly, and we can continue to scale those as we go to remain more accurate. A good place to start, especially in this case, is with really large noticeable leaves. We're lining those up with our branching stem structure, making sure we don't have any intersecting polys that'll show up when we're rendering it, and just kind of starting to get a shape that looks like the actual plant. Definitely making use of the fact that we have different types of leaves, not just one single leaf, and laying them out in a way that makes sense. This kind of curved, lumpy leaf coming up from the small stem at the bottom, a lot like some of the plants that we saw in the field. Again, checking for no intersecting planes, and just going piece by piece and building up the model. We'll jump ahead a little bit here to creating a part that's a little more complex, like a flower that's made up of, in this case, like 5 stems, 5 small leaves, a few stamen, and a spur. But we're really basing see here we're rescaling to more closely match the photo, and referencing the photo, and really trying to just recreate the shapes that we see in our references in the actual flower. Taking these large petals and bending them, considering the weight of the petal, how they'll fall, making sure we have variation there in the texture on the petal, with the white coming up on the one type of petal and not on the other type. Spinning them around. And then we'll jump again, and we can see a finished blue-violet plant model looking something like this. All of our plant parts are combined, matched up with our branching stem structure, and all resized and measured and laid out in an accurate and believable way. Once we have this model complete, it's important to just one more time kind of assess the poly count and level of detail that we have in all of the individual parts. We want to view the mesh with no outlines on and see where do we see, really noticeable polygons. We don't want anything egregious, anything super noticeable, but we do want to still remain low poly. In the work that we've done, our desired poly count varies totally based on the size and complexity of each individual plant. Like a large tree could be anywhere between 10,000 and 15,000 tries, and a small flower could be as low as 50 but up to 1,000. Our blue-violet model that we created is about 500 tries. Before we begin moving on with updates to our texture sheet, we just want to do one more pass to make sure they're totally cleaned up. We want to remove any artifacts and make sure we do a color balance pass to make sure all of the different parts of the plant look like they actually came from the same plant. A lot of times our source photos will be pulled from different plants. Like I know for a fact that our leaves for our blue-violet here came from 3 different plants. But we did do a color balance pass and a lot of other adjustment layers in Photoshop to make the leaves look more like they actually came from the same plant at the same time of day in the same location, which again is really important to create a believable and accurate texture for our model. So as mentioned before, we aren't working with any high poly sculpts or photogrammetry, so we can't pull a normal from those, but we are working with high quality source textures and photos. So we are able to generate a pretty good normal map using those textures. In this case, we're using Quixel Suite, taking our color map that we've created and kind of playing with the size and the depth to make sure we're creating a normal map that we're happy with. A lot of times we'll take the normal, apply it to the mesh, see how it looks, and kind of go back and forth until we find a normal that really reflects that level of believability and accuracy that we want. But in general, we're using source photos that are high enough quality to generate a good-looking normal map. Once we're happy with our color map from Photoshop and also the normal map that we've generated, we always take our models into Substance Painter to do a final pass, which includes just cleaning up some textures. It can also include creating textures for things like stems if we didn't have really useful source photos for those. We're of course going to pull our normal and color both in, make sure we have a material set that supports transparency, and then we will apply our maps. And with our maps inserted, we can start to really get a good visualization of what we've created so far. A lot of times we'll play with the roughness here in Photoshop. We'll create a fill layer, a black fill layer to kind of get rid of some of those white outlines. And we can see that things based on our great source material, things already look good. Got good light bouncing around. The leaves look great. The only thing that does, of course, need work is the stem, which is just a flat color based on what we created earlier in our texture map. So we'll use a bunch of the tools that Substance Painter offers. Of course, we'll do some masking with some grunge materials, maybe a dirt brush, and then we'll just start adding detail and pulling colors from source materials, from our reference photos, and just kind of trying to match a stem pattern that looks like the source photos. So we'll fast forward a bit we've created a pretty good looking kind of grungy, dirty little stem for the plant. And this is also a good time to add variations in color at different points in the stem. Like the blue violet has a little bit of a red hue as it gets closer to the flower, so we've added that. But at this point, our texture looks pretty good. We can export that. Yeah, it does. It looks great. We can export that for use in Unreal. So before we actually start pulling our maps and our meshes into Unreal, there are a few more that we need to create. Most importantly, our subsurface scattering map. We'll use the final color map that we created in Substance Painter to then create this subsurface scattering map back in Photoshop. We do this by putting our texture over a black background, and then we hand paint a black overlay to different parts of the texture. It's really vital that we are constantly referring to our sources, both the material and our research, to create a realistic subsurface scattering map that represents the way that light passes through these different parts of the plant. If you've taken a video of the plant from underneath with the sunlight coming through, that can be super useful. Photos will also do for that, or just seeing the plants in the field and kind of getting an idea for that. And then you'll want to paint over the color map, blocking out where light would come through. So, bark or like twig would be solid black. Our leaves would have some dark areas where the leaves are thicker or closer to the stem, but never totally black. A light, delicate stem like our blue violet here would of course not be solid black because light does pass through that. Petals would be super light, and all of that will reflect really well in Unreal. The last couple of maps that we need before we can start working in Unreal, in our case, are our wind maps. They're based on a material we've created in Unreal. They're really low res, just basically some data to feed into our material. And the first one is our wind block texture, which is just a really simple black and white texture that prevents the UVs of the color map from moving around with our wind material. So essentially we're just painting black over areas that we don't want to kind of sway in the wind. And we just take our texture, our color map, make it 128 by 128, and paint over with black. The second texture, which we just call wind, is RGB, different channels, red, green, blue. And again, we're just painting over different separate parts of the plant with solid red, solid blue, solid green. This is fed into the material later on, and they kind of shift around based on which color is painted over them. So now that the main parts of our plant model are finished, we've got our main mesh, our textures and everything, we can start working on our LODs. The first one we'll do is a mid-level LOD to be used in Unreal, of course, to improve performance. And in this way, we get more direct control over the way that the LODs work rather than having Unreal generate them. In Maya, we'll duplicate our original model and just reduce it by hand. We'll remove edges where they're not necessary, like maybe on the stems and the cylinders. We'll use the reduce function a lot on face groups to have control over where we're losing polys. But generally, we want to aim for about half the original poly count of our mesh, or even lower if it's not damaging the profile and the way the plant looks from afar. With our blue violet here, we started with a 498 and ended with 149, which is a really good reduction. And at a distance, it's imperceivable. So for our lowest level LOD, we want to have an actual billboard, and we create that by taking our main model into Substance Painter, as we did before, and just using iRay to render a flat image. It's always front-facing, really good profile that shows off all the different parts of the plant, and definitely a low FOV to create a believable billboard. And once we've lined that up, we got the legging looking good, we just export that as a PNG. So once we've created our billboard texture in iRay and exported it, we can take it into Maya and apply it to a flat plane with a new material, a lot like we did with our reference photos in the scene. A lot of times we'll need to either scale the billboard mesh or adjust the UVs to prevent stretching on the texture. Like in this case, we did a planar UV that gave it the full UV fill, and we're just moving that to fit the mesh. Once we have that set up, we just want to make sure it lines up well. Looks good, looks good. Lines up well with our main mesh. Maybe a few minor adjustments using front-facing or side-facing cameras. And when it looks good, like it does there, we just make sure all of our high mesh, our mid-level LOD, and our billboard are all 0, 0 with transforms frozen. And then we can just use Maya's built-in LOD creation tools to set up our LODs. We don't need to worry about screen height percentage values right now because we're going to do that in Unreal later on. Yep. So we just create our LOD group. And everything is already working great. We rename the mesh and we export it for use in Unreal. So now that our plant model creation process is actually complete, we can import the meshes and the textures into Unreal. Within Unreal, we use 3 different master materials that we set up to take those textures and apply them to the meshes. We have a plant master, which every single plant uses, that includes wind and opacity, which small plants, that'll be their main material. Even trees will use it on their branches. We have a bark master for larger plants and trees, which uses repeatables. So really large sections of bark and trunks will use that. Our small blue violet won't, of course. And then we do have a billboard master material which controls the billboards for each plant, which is our lowest LOD level. And we'll go through those. Our plant master material uses color, normal, subsurface scattering, and wind map inputs, all of which we created in both Substance Painter and Photoshop. The color map is of course plugged into the base color node and also the opacity mask node in order to enable transparency on our plants. The normal map is plugged into, of course, the normal node, but we also multiply it by a editable parameter to give us control of the normal strength. This is really valuable to have in real time in Engine, as it gives us kind of an avenue to more closely match our reference and source material. Certain plants normal will just read better with a little extra strength or even a little less strength. And it really does vary plant by plant, so it's extremely useful to have that as an editable parameter. Our subsurface scattering map in our plant master material is plugged into the subsurface color node to enable subsurface scattering. We also plug the green channel into the roughness and opacity nodes passed through a LERP with some other exposed parameters. This can help kind of give us more in-engine control on the light bleed through the plants and some of the roughness levels, just to have another little avenue of control in-engine to more closely match our source material. Our wind block map is plugged into the world position offset, but it's also multiplied by a simple grass wind node. And we have exposed parameters for different factors of that node, like intensity, weight, and speed, all of which give us more plant by plant control of the wind, because of course different types of plants react completely different to wind. Some factors to consider when editing the parameters of the wind material for each plant is that small plants low to the ground really do blow a lot less, even if they're really light plants. Larger plants that are really high up do blow more, but often with less intensity if they're really large and heavy. When you can, you should always reference real-world video or record video out in the field to kind of match up. Our wind map is modified and plugged into the UV input of our color node. This kind of causes the UVs on the color node to shift and adds a little bit of kind of a rustling or wiggling effect to our textures. We have an exposed parameter that we multiply the wind map by that allows us to control the intensity of the rustling effect in real time, going from no rustling at all to a really intense rustling, again totally based on how the actual plant would react to wind. Our bark master uses a standard color normal input with, again, very similar exposed parameters, so we can continue to have real-time control of different properties. In this case, also exposed parameters that control the tiling properties for different trees, different types of bark, especially ones that have texture sheets that aren't 1-1 in shape. You can increase the tile to have those fit the model. In the case of our blue violet, we don't use this particular material, but anything large enough to have a tileable material would use this. Our billboard master material makes use of the billboard color map we created using iRay earlier, and also uses a rotate about axis node with multiple inputs plugged into the world position offset node that allows the billboard to constantly rotate towards the camera. So you're always seeing the full billboard, which is completely necessary when using a totally flat billboard rather than a collection of flat billboards. We also have an exposed color tint parameter that we can alter the tint of the billboard in real time based on scene lighting and things like that. So from our master materials in Unreal, we of course will create material instances for each plant. For our blue violet, we aren't creating a material instance of the bark master, as I mentioned, because we're only using a single color map and a billboard map. Within these material instances, we apply each of our individual different maps, our base color, normal, subsurface scattering, and 2 wind maps. We can also see that we have access to the exposed parameters, including wind speed, intensity, normal strength, opacity of the individual leaves, to give us just another level of control and ability to match up to our source. With our material instances ready and filled in with the textures we imported, we're then ready to apply them to the meshes we imported in the mesh editor. In the case of the blue violet, that would be our instance material from our plant master and our instance material from our billboard master. With the whole mesh in view, we can tweak the specific parameters in the materials, again, to make sure they fit the specific plant. For our blue violet, we should have minimal wind effect since it's such a small plant, so low to the ground, usually surrounded by other plants. But there should also be noticeable light bleed where if you were able to get up underneath it or even just from the side, see this really delicate flower, a lot of light would be passing through it. Once our mesh is totally set up with its materials and we have our parameters where we like them, we can start editing our LOD settings to make sure they're appropriate for the plant that we're working on. For the base model, mid-LOD, and our billboard, we will be setting different screen size values using the LOD picker to make sure that the plant transitions from the different stages of the model well. The screen size value determines at which point the LODs come into view, and it really what's appropriate really varies based totally on the individual plant. Ideally, these settings should allow you to zoom in and out, get close to the plant, back up, without any noticeable pop-ins on the model. You shouldn't see the mid-level come in, you shouldn't really see the billboard come in, even though the billboard is just a single plane. Once we have all of our mesh settings where we like them, the materials, the parameters, the LOD settings, all applied to our mesh, we can create an actual foliage type to start using the model in a landscape setting. So we'll create a brand new foliage type, add our mesh to it, give it an appropriate name, and then we can add that to an Unreal landscape level. Once it's added to the landscape, we can edit a ton of the parameters for painting. This includes scale, which should always have some variation as the plants will be smaller and larger just based on natural conditions. They should of course rotate as you place them. You can adjust the density with which you paint. And from there you can actually start using the model. Once we have all of our foliage settings in a good spot and our mesh is totally ready to go, and we've built up a collection of different foliage types with these preset values, we can quickly and accurately paint really large scale environments really quickly and have a really believable and accurate result. And here is an example of just painting out our blue violet into a scene with a bunch of other plants and having it really quickly and naturally and easily just fill in and fit the level. So to close, we've gone over the entire process for creating a scientifically accurate, low poly optimized plant model, starting from gathering source material out in the field all the way to building the mesh and eventually painting with it in Unreal. This process is super useful when you need something that's really optimized, but still really believable. It's perfect for projects that, AR projects, VR projects, things that don't have a lot of bandwidth for mesh detail, but you still need something that is believable. Thank you so much for watching and for taking the time to listen. If you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or even through my portfolio, and I'd be happy to discuss more of the process or answer any questions that you have at all. Thank you again.
Hello! Continuing where we left off on our course from Virtual Nature as a Digital Twin, Botanically Correct 3D Augmented Reality and Virtual Reality Optimized Low-polygon and Photogrammetry High-polygon models, I'm presenting on Photogrammetry with Reality Capture, a workflow for Unreal Engine 5. So, photogrammetry, what is it? Photogrammetry is the process by which a model is created using multiple captured images taken in a 3D space. For our virtual nature project, I've been looking into using these techniques to aid in the creation of highly accurate plant models. While photogrammetry may not be suitable for all types of plants, it is very useful for some larger, more stable models. I'll discuss that later. Having these settings and equipment are also useful for photographing the plants in order to rebuild them in 3D software like Maya, or alternatively, free software like Blender. As you can see here, this is my first photogrammetry test that I did on a succulent in my yard. You can see the images are placed around in this kind of spiderweb pattern around the plant, and I'll discuss what that is. So, what types of plants does photogrammetry work on? Photogrammetry works best on large, solid, stationary objects, mainly tree trunks, succulent plants like you saw, some like seeds, pine cones, and ground textures. You can even create these seamless 3D textures. You should avoid doing small leafy plants that can be moved in the wind or have really small complex tendrils on them. So I have some images here showing that there's this little like plant with little tiny little seeds and flowers on it. It's way too intricate for photogrammetry. It would not be able to solve it by calculating all the different model like vertices all over this plant. And it also move in the wind, and you need something that's going to be stable that you'll be able to walk around and take multiple pictures of. As you can see, there's a tree that I did later in this project where I went all the way around it. You could see that it's large, stable, has interesting elements that it will be interesting to see with photogrammetry on it, such as the bark being a river birch. And it has a very easy setting where I can go all the way around it and capture all the pictures I need of it. Preparing equipment and subject for a photogrammetry shoot. So as you can see, here's some of the equipment that I use. The first thing that you'll need is a camera. I use my Canon 80D. You may use any camera as long as it takes at least like a 24 megapixel image. Most smartphones do nowadays. You'll also need a lens, which if you have a phone, obviously it'll have a lens. But for this Canon 80D, I use a 24-105 millimeter lens. Zoom lenses can be kind of dangerous because when you use a zoom lens, it'll cause solving errors because your photogrammetry software will typically think that you're using one lens zoom focus. So if you have a zoom lens like me, I use gaff tape to make sure that it doesn't zoom while I'm taking pictures. But you'll probably want to have around 24 to 50 millimeters for most things. Those are your best bet for photogrammetry. I recommend bringing some SD cards with you. As you can see, I have a SanDisk 128 gigabyte up there. You'll want something with high read and write speeds as you're going to be taking a lot of pictures and you'll want to be able to upload them quickly to your computer to check them to make sure your model's solving correctly. And also having a faster card means you can take picture faster. So win-win. You'll also be taking a lot of pictures, so 128 gigabytes may not be big enough for a huge shoot if you're doing thousands of pictures. So bring a couple extra just in case, because there's nothing worse than running out of space. You'll probably also want to bring a background tarp with supports, especially for photogrammetry with plants. Because they get so intricate and you're trying to take all these pictures, you're going to want to be able to separate it from its background so that they only get the model that you want. You could also bring a tripod or monopod. A tripod could be helpful if you're trying to make sure you get the exact same height everywhere around a model and maybe your camera doesn't take pictures as quickly. So having it something to keep it stable and focus the entire times isn't ideal. A monopod would just be that with a single stick, and you can adjust the height so that you always get the same exact height when you're going around the model. Photogrammetry markers are suggested. They're little markers that you can purchase that allow you to put them next to the model that you're taking a picture of. These markers will be picked up by whatever software you're using. So for reality capture, they have their own marker, and it'll be able to find the marker in the image and use it to better figure out exactly what's going on in your model. And lights would be very ideal if you're in a setting that doesn't have the best lighting and you want to make sure that you have enough light information in order to take the pictures, and a suitable rendering laptop. These photogrammetry softwares are very, very heavy on taxing on your computer. You'll want something with a good CPU, a good graphics card, plenty of storage, and an SSD. Make sure that you have a computer that is suitable to run something like reality capture. As the worse specs you have, the longer it'll take for the models to be made. Preparing equipment and subject for a photogrammetry shoot. So first you'll want to probably start with your camera settings because you won't want to change those at all during your shoot. You'll want to keep them right and ready from the get-go and have them be the same from start to finish. So for photogrammetry, you'll take many high-quality, crisp photos in succession. The most important settings to check before taking images are your ISO and shutter speed. When shooting with the DSLR, keep your ISO as low as possible to avoid a noisy image. So I can show right here the difference between a lower and a high ISO picture. The top one is lower ISO, but as you can see, this makes the image darker. However, there's less noise, which are those little like pixels in your image. You can see it's a little bit more crisp. But the higher ISO, it's brighter, which you get more information from the light. However, there's more noise in those darker areas. So what you'll want to do is have your ISO high enough that you can get a good color image and you can get enough information, but you want it low enough that it's not going to be noisy because both things could interfere with the solving of your photogrammetry model. You'll want to shoot also in manual mode. Don't do automatic, because when you do automatic, it'll automatically adjust as you're going around the picture or around the model. So that could cause issues if you're trying to make sure everything's consistent. So shoot in manual mode, make sure your settings are correct, you have a good ISO, keep your f-stop to 5, f8, and f16 for your best results. This will give you a larger depth of field and it'll keep everything in focus, which is what you want. Lighting. Lighting is the single most important factor for any photographic medium. It's ideal to work in a space with a matte, solid color background. This will make it easier for photogrammetry software to separate your model from the background without noise. Ideally, you'll want it to be in a studio environment where you can set up your lights perfectly and you can go all the way around your model. But obviously, when you're doing something like a tree outside, you don't have that luxury. So you'll want to make sure that you find the best optimized lighting situation when you're taking these pictures. So you'll want to go on a nice cloudy, overcast day because when it's cloudy, everything is kind of the same diffuse color. There's no big bright spots of light. There's no harsh shadows that are, going in certain ways, because all of those things can make it really difficult for your photogrammetry software to figure out, okay, is that a shadow or is that part of the model? I don't know. So to be safe, try to do it on a cloudy day. If you can't do it on a cloudy day and it's sunny, maybe you'll want to bring some extra supplies to make sure that when you're taking the pictures, you have like a light or something to make sure every image has the same diffuse lighting. So now that you have your settings and now you know what the situation is for your model, it's time to capture photos of your subject. So I typically start about 5 to 10 feet away if possible and do a full circle around the tree, coming in closer with every circle until I'm right up close with the subject. You'll also want to capture images from looking up, looking straight on, and looking below, and give them all the different points of view so that your program captures every angle because this is a 3D space. You'll also need to make sure that between each image you have some part of the last image in your next one. So try to take them close together. Don't like take one chunk and then go really far and take another because the photogrammetry software works by taking that last image that is on there and then going to the next one and combining the features of both to create one solid texture model. So you need to make sure that you're taking them in quick succession, close to each other, and just as many as you can. If you do for some reason need to step away or have to pause, I would put your hand in front of your camera and take a picture just to like let the software know, hey, I'm going to a different part of the model, start over the solving process. Don't try to mix things that shouldn't be mixed. And that way you can delete that picture later on and it'll be okay. You'll want to take as many pictures as possible because there's nothing worse than when you get home and you realize that you don't have enough images and you get these weird blurry like holes in your model that the thing can't solve. So just try to go as many as you can. But if you feel like 100's enough and you got everything, try 100. It might still work. You'll also probably want to capture some additional images just in case. Because if you're going somewhere to do a on-site shoot, such as at like a park or like at a botanical garden, you'll only get that time to take pictures of it. So get as many as you can. If you have a device like a GoPro, like one of those 4K or 1080p GoPros, that's perfect for going around and just doing a video of the model from all the different angles that you captured with your picture. This makes sure that, if you miss something in one of your models, the GoPro will pick it up. A cell phone can also take a video and you can upload that. The reality capture program takes photos as well as videos, so that's perfect. And if you have access to a drone is really great for capturing the tops and higher parts of the models that you just can't physically reach. So if you have it, awesome. If you don't, it's okay. So now that you've got home and you have all your pictures, it's time to bring them into reality capture and see what you've got to work with. So when you have them all loaded off of your SD card and onto your computer, you'll want to go ahead and put them into reality capture by going to Workflow, Add Imagery, Inputs. You can also select all your images and just drag them into that box on the left side of the screen. That works too. You'll want to make sure that you're working off of your computer and not off your SD card because the SD card will cause lag and it just could lead to issues like if it becomes disconnected for some reason, reality capture might freak out. You don't want to risk any of that. So just put it on your computer so that you know it's there. And if anything happens, it's not going to lose your pictures. So once your images are loaded, you can select the Align tab and start aligning your pictures. This process takes a bit of time because it's going to take all your pictures and kind of visualize where they are in a 3D space and create this point cloud visualization of what your model may look like. So you can see in this picture here, the rings around it, you can see the larger ring that's kind of more spread out and then the closer rings as they get in and the different angles. You'll want to be able to make sure you see all those images pop in and you can see the model clearly. If you, for some reason, don't see all your images or your model is very partial, there is probably an issue with your shoot. You didn't get enough information for it to align them properly. You can try re-importing them and selecting all of them and clicking align again. But if it doesn't work, just try to see where the issue is because it'll tell you on the side of the screen which pictures are exactly where. Now you'll want to set your reconstruction region and your ground plane. After your point cloud has visualized exactly what your model is going to look like, you'll want to trim it down so that you don't try to render this entire scene, because you'll probably get a lot of background elements and extra trees and bushes and things you don't really want in your model. So as you can see here, you go to Tools, Set Reconstruction Region, and it'll give you this bounding box that you can click to drag in. Sometimes your model may come in at an angle, so it's tilted, 45 degrees. If that's the case, you can go to Tools, Set Ground Plane, and you can rotate your entire scene to make sure that it's, sitting correctly in the right orientation. You'll want to make sure you trim it as much as possible. For me, when I'm doing trees, I sometimes trim off a little extra off the top of the tree and the bottom of the tree that I don't want to get the ground, or any whole parts in the tree that I don't have enough images of. I just crop it down to what I know will render correctly. So once your photos are aligned and your reconstruction region is set, you can create your model. Start with the preview quality reconstruction to show a rough estimate on how your model will render. You'll see the reconstruction model preview, normal, and high detail. Preview will be quick. It should render almost instantly and give you this very primitive one on the far left of the screen. It'll probably be really low poly and have weird artifacts and stuff, but it should give you a rough idea of what's in your bounding box, what your model is going to look like, if you have enough detail, etc. Once you're certain you like the settings and like what you're seeing, you can go to normal detail. It should trim off some of that excess artifacts, and it should look a little bit more high quality. Sometimes normal may be enough for whatever you're doing a photogrammetry model of. But if you want it to be the best, which if you're doing photogrammetry, that's probably what you want, you can do high detail, and this will give you every nook and cranny that you can possibly gather from your images. This takes a pretty long time, so I would go grab a drink, some popcorn, and go watch something while it renders, because this could take up to 20 minutes. So once you have this super high quality mesh model, you'll notice that it's super, super detailed, and you'll be like, how the heck am I going to put this into any real-time environment and have it render quickly? We'll talk about that later with Nani, but while you're working with it, it's good to kind of reduce it a little. So I would go to Simplify, which is under Tools, Mesh Model, and there's a button that says Simplify Tool. It'll appear on the left side of the screen in a little menu, and you'll see it as it looks on this slide. You'll want to make sure that you have your color reprojection and normal reprojection selected. This will allow it to reduce your model and allow the normal map that was generated from this high quality model to be baked onto the lower poly model. This will make it run a little bit more efficiently in reality capture and make it easier to texture later on. It'll also produce this really cool looking normal map with its rainbow colored neat. And this will be needed for when you import it into other softwares and other rendering programs. So it's good to do. Now that you've got your model all, reduced, created, ready to go, it's time to texture it, make it look like a real tree or real model. So I suggest running the correct colors first in case some of your images are in a different lighting. You could see that in your workflow process area. You could see it next to colorize and texture as seen on that menu. And then once it has corrected all the colors, this makes them a little bit more even. You can go to workflow, process, texture. This process also takes a bit of time. Now it's time to export as an FBX with the albedo and the normal textures. So as you can see, you now have your textured photogrammetry model, and you can export it so that you can use it in other softwares. I export using .fbx format with the texture set as .png with UDIM file type and 24-bit BGR. You can usually get away with a single texture set on smaller models, but if you're doing a larger scan, like of an entire house or of a huge, natural environment, you'll probably need several UDIMs in order to get all those texture sets into another program and to have all of it work properly without having to sacrifice quality, trying to squeeze it all onto one texture set. So now that you have your photogrammetry model, you may need to go ahead and model some additional artistic additions for your model. So since I did a tree, I didn't have enough information in order to capture all the branches and leaves. So as an artist, it's my job to recreate that artistically and to match the style of the tree. So as you can see here, I have a branch that I clipped off of a tree that I was doing a shoot of. I brought it over to a setting where it had a little bit more, it was a little bit easier to photograph so that the background was plain and easier to work with in Photoshop. I isolated the branch and made a image with a transparent background, and I brought it into Maya. In Maya, I created a simple tree branch pattern. I brought in some planes and I cross-sectioned them so that it would create a little bit more of the sense of volume that you would get with a tree. And then I brought in my image and placed those on the image planes to kind of create the illusion of having a tree with luscious leaves and branches. This is still sort of photogrammetry because I took the photo of the tree branch, so it's still pretty correct, although it's not perfect. So now that we have all the components of our model, it's time to bring it into the real-time environment. So we're going to be using Unreal Engine 5 and its nanites feature in order to use these huge photogrammetry models in an optimized setting for virtual reality and augmented reality like we use in our virtual nature project. So what is Nanite? Nanite is the new and improved virtualized geometry system implemented in Unreal Engine 5. It integrates as seamlessly as possible into existing engine workflows while using novel approach for storing and rendering mesh data. During import, the meshes are analyzed and broken down into hierarchical clusters of triangle groups. This is from the Unreal 5 documentation. I kind of briefly show here what those nanite visualizations look like when you bring your model in. So, how do you bring it in as nanite? Well, it's pretty easy. So you'll just go as you would import any model into Unreal Engine 5 and click on the right click in your browser, click import model or import information, select your FBX that you exported from reality capture. Make sure Nanite is enabled, and it's just a checkbox on there that I show in this image. Make sure your normal import method is set to import normals, because as you remember, we created those normal maps. You'll want to not create a material, because if you do create a material, you have to unlink it and then set up your own material later. Just by not creating a material, it'll make it a little easier for us to set everything up correctly. So you'll want to go to your modeling editing tools, which you can get to by going to the shortcut Shift F7. Go to your material editor and select all the faces and remove the material IDs. This makes sure that you have a fresh slate for working with and you can just apply your materials as needed. You can create the new material and assign it. So as you can see, I show how I brought in my albedo base color and in my normal map, and it connected it to a simple material. It's nothing fancy, but it'll do the job. Now you can link that material to your nanite mesh. And voila, we have our model. You can see now that it is fully textured, working in Engine with nanite enabled. You can start setting up blueprints to connect all your branches to the top of the tree and have everything set up in a photorealistic environment. Shown here is the final tree model in a blueprint with the photogrammetry trunks with the 3D modeled branches with limbs and leaves attached. I created materials for the limbs and leaves based on images that I took from the photogrammetry shoot. So here's a step-by-step flow chart of the photogrammetry process with reality capture. You need to prepare your equipment and subject. This is important to making sure that you have everything consistent and ready to go when the shoot comes. Capture photos of your subject. Capture any supplementary videos or other data. Process your images on a computer. Upload the images into reality capture. Align the photos to create a point cloud visualization. Set the reconstruction region and ground plane alignment. Create your mesh model construction. Simplify and generate normals. Texture your model. Export as an FBX with albedo and normal textures. Make any additional modifications in Maya or in other modeling software. Import the model into UE5 as a nanite. And create the new material with textures and apply. And by that point, you'll have a nanite photogrammetry model ready to use for whatever Unreal Engine 5 project you need it for. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Crissy Peters, and I'm a 3D environment artist. I have a bachelor's in art from character animation at UCF and a master's of science from the Florida Interactive Entertainment Academy, FIA, and it is also at the University of Central Florida. I spent my childhood alongside my father, who is an environmentalist and a herpetologist with a deep love for nature, so I got a lot of experience going out and photographing plants and animals. I now combine my interests and skills in creating highly realistic and scientifically accurate models of plants and environments, combining cinematography, game technology, and photogrammetry. Please add me on LinkedIn on linkedin.com/in/Crissy-Peters.